Some highlights in this episode include: modern youth has less autonomy and agency than generations before. The agricultural revolution was a step back for most of us. In the past, people lived in harmony with nature. Don't believe a word of this lie. The structure of society dictates the structure of religion. Living in hierarchical structures is something alien to human nature. The 60s were the pinnacle of the Enlightenment. Two major developments in the last few decades caused a huge setback in the lives of young people. Psychology is something good, but it can become toxic as well. The experimentation on our youth with Ritalin is very dangerous. Intrinsic motivation, having a sense of agency, self-esteem, knowing you are competent on at least some important skills, knowing you can stand up to the hardships of life. All these are of the utmost importance, especially for young people growing up. And for the last decades, these life skills have come under serious attack as never before. We are facing a young generation plagued with anxiety problems, depression, poor coping skills, underdeveloped social skills, and a severe lack of energy to conquer the world. How will they be when they are grown-ups? How will their current mental state affect our world, given the fact the human race is facing huge problems, maybe even existential ones? I'll start my story way back in evolution to show this sense of competence, intrinsic motivation, agency, and initiative is inborn in all humans and the result of millions of years of evolution. By nature, people are motivated and they do have self-esteem. This goes natural, but it can be shattered by circumstances, in most cases by forms of mismatchings between the way our modern society is structured and the way our mental software has evolved. We will discuss what has fundamentally changed in our way of living when we transformed from hunter-gatherers to farmers and city dwellers. Next, we focus on the Enlightenment, culminating in the search for liberty in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century, only to find this newfound freedom shattered a few decades later. This all having to do with some cultural trends that started with benevolent and positive intentions, but in the end turned out to be horrendous monsters. I'm talking about the safety culture and social media. First, have a small recap on our transition from hunter-gatherers to modern life. For a more in-depth discussion, see episode 10 in this YouTube series. Maybe you remember, our far ancestors as hunter-gatherers enjoyed a rather pleasant life with a healthy diet, with much proteins and a healthy, diverse food. Meat, fish, insects, eggs, mollusks, fruit and vegetables. About everything they could find. In times of abundance, when he only had to work about 15 to 20 hours a week. Furthermore, we had little to suffer from parasites or infectious diseases. We dropped our feces outside the campment and we had no livestock or other animals adding their feces to it. And since we moved to a clean place every few weeks or so, hygiene was not a problem. How different this would become once we settled on one place, with animals around us. Unintentionally, we created a paradise for parasites and dangerous pathogens. Skeletons of hunter-gatherers show we were much bigger in comparison to farmers, and there were less signs of malnutrition or growth defects because of depleting diseases and heavy, monotonous, strenuous labor. Farming was end of Eden, of living in paradise, as historian Colin Touch called it. Furthermore, hunter-gatherer communities were quite egalitarian. Everyone was as rich as anyone else, because you could only be as rich as you could carry yourself, as there were no beasts of burden nor slaves to do the work for you. Material wealth was limited to maybe some crafty made hand axes or spear points, and perhaps someone owned the fur of a big carnivore as a symbol of his courage and dexterity. But other than that, everyone was equal. Of course, people differ in physical strength, intelligence, seniority, status and personality. But that was about it. Also, there was no hierarchical leadership. Who was in charge depended on the task or challenge at hand. People differ in personalities, values, interests and skills. and this makes individuals choose a niche and specialize in a limited set of skills and competencies. When the group is trying to catch fish, the best fisherman was in charge. When tracking deer, the one proved to be an expert in this was leading the operations. You can compare it to a modern group of friends. There's no formal leader. Decisions are always joint decisions, and sometimes there is a heated debate. And overall, the one with the most expertise on the topic at hand has a bigger say. So, being the leader is no fixed role and there's no fixed hierarchy. Homo sapiens split about 7 million years ago from our common ancestors we share with chimps and bonobos. This happened in Africa, the place the biggest part of our evolution took place. About 500,000 years ago, groups migrated to Europe and later to Asia, Australia and the Americas. This was by no means of the imagination an intended trip with a clear goal in mind. More probable is, groups of hunter-gatherers moved on when game became scarce, moving back and forth in little steps over huge spans of time, traveled great distances. In the end, conquering the whole of the world. When you hear stories of primitive man living in close harmony with nature, don't even believe a little bit of it. Sustainability was a concept totally unknown to them. We know they used every means possible to catch game, as you can see in this picture where they drive a herd of horses in the abyss, maybe eating only 2 or 3 of them, leaving the other carcasses to rot away. No wonder with growing human populations, man faced food scarcity in the end. And this was the prime motivation to move to new areas, in the end inhabiting all of the world. And then there was no place to go anymore. Wherever man went, he left a trail of exterminated large mammals behind him. Take for example the Shasta ground sloth, a huge, slow and peaceful herbivore, eating the leaves of trees just like modern-day giraffes do. Because he had no natural enemies, he had lost all of his fear responses, and this made him an easy prey for the first Native Americans. The same goes for horses. They only came back to America with the European conquistadores. Elephant-like animals and other big prey. Man knew no limits. But what will you do when big game get really scarce? Well, you hunt smaller game. But this requires much more effort and offers less gain. Or you refrain from eating a young animal you just caught and wait until it grows fat and then eat it. And that is the first form of agriculture. As with trees with delicious fruits, you weed away competing plants, fence the premises to keep away 2- and 4-legged competitors, and you stay there to protect and later enjoy your special tree. The first garden was born. So, don't think of agriculture as a wonderful, clever innovation, a way to make our lives easier and mankind happier. On the contrary, life for most of us became heavier and more unpleasant. Historian Colin Tudge marked farming as the end of Eden. Farmers ate poorer diets. The long hours of hard, monotonous work made their bodies weaker and their body size was considerably less than that of our healthy hunter-gatherers. This we know from skeletons archaeologists found. On the top of that became the diseases. Parasites and other pathogens multiplied like hell in this new environment. Farmers stayed at one place. Their excrements, together with those of cattle and other farm animals, piled up to heaps, being paradises for all kinds of malevolent germs. Although we lived shorter, more children died and more people died of diseases, populations as a whole grew, even exponentially. Women as hunter-gatherers only gave birth to a child every 4 or 5 years. Now, because of new cooking techniques to prepare food and the availability of milk from cattle and staying at one place, women in farmer communities gave birth every 1 or 2 years. Overpopulation took off by then and hasn't stopped since. Also, economic and power structures changed. For the first time in history, the concept of land ownership emerged. Before that, tribes of course had their territories and chased off others. But there was no fixed division of land between individuals, as became the rule in the agricultural societies. And as Marx pointed out, once you gain some wealth, it is much easier to acquire even more wealth. You just employ people who need to pay, by then in natural goods like food. But of course, you pay them less than the yields of their work. The surplus of the labor was for the capitalist, Marx would say. Egalitarianism changed in haves versus have-nots. This led to a staggering inequality between the rich and the poor. And this fundamentally impacted the way leadership was executed. We witnessed the rise of the hierarchy. With the structure of society, the structure of leadership and the way we cooperate changed fundamentally. In the old days, leadership was situational, depending on your skills and the task at hand. It could change by the moment. In the new society, it became a fixed role. Someone was appointed leader and kept his position for a longer time, and later even transferred it to his descendants. As said, wealth discrepancies grew. With economic power came military and political power, resulting in grand-scale oppression and the emergence of classes in the Marxist sense of the word. In the old days, leadership was clearly visible. We lived in small groups, and someone pretending to be good at catching fish but didn't deliver, he soon lost his status as the best fish catcher. Everything happened before our very eyes. With hierarchy and landowners becoming big landowners, becoming barons and kings, their personality and activities disappeared out of sight. Peasants simply were not in the position to travel to a faraway capital to see the king with their own eyes. This also caused the emergence of middle managers, lower nobility, civil servants and other intermediate positions, monitoring the daily operations. As hunter-gatherers, you being a leader for the moment was contingent on your skills, competency and performance. In agriculture societies, wealth and leadership became inherited positions. Nobility became an almost genetic class in itself. Royal blood supposedly giving them special skills and powers. And with all this, religion changed as well, this being a stamp of the way society is structured. Hunter-gatherers were polytheistic. They themselves had the will and agency, and so had all systems around them. The river could be benevolent as it gave you fish, but it was revengeful when your kid drowned in it. It had personality and agency. In groups, decisions were made as a result of a hodgepodge of voices, with no single voice dominating everything. In agriculture, the hierarchy emerged, with only one person at the top. This model transferred to religion. Monotheism is the exact copy of the way the human society was organized, with one supreme, invisible, almighty power governing things by an appointed class of middlemen, called popes, bishops and priests. As a result, the vast majority of the population was kept small. They lost a big part of their self-determination, freedom, voice and agency their forefathers did have. Intrinsic motivation and rewards were replaced by external directions, external motivations and reward schemes. Hierarchy reached its summit in, for example, the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church and the factories in the Industrial Revolution. Hierarchies are the perfect instruments for mass-scale violence, mass-scale religions and mass-scale production. People were reduced to pawns. Not their personality, only their hands, their capacity for labor was what mattered. A reduction of people as humans. Collectively, we may have grown smarter. As individuals, we became dumber in comparison to the hunter-gatherers preceding us. Only a small group at the top could express autonomy, creativity and intrinsic motivation. This state of affairs continued for many thousands of years. But individuals and groups of people have always tried to recover their long-lost freedom. Sometimes with success, many times not, only to be smashed by the powers of an oppressors. But sometimes they succeeded, even on a big scale and for a long time. I see the Enlightenment as one of the big emancipating forces in the West and ultimately in the world. It started a few centuries ago with upcoming economic increasingly successful middle classes and bourgeoisie, wanting their rights and positions recognized by the feudal nobility. The Magna Carta was a defining moment in this, forcing nobility to subject themselves to the same laws as they did, and forcing them to recognize some hard-fought liberties. It was a huge step forward, all people becoming equal for the law. But there was more. The Enlightenment came up with a new set of ideas about what constituted truth and which arguments should win the debate. No longer the authority of the church was the only source of truth, but science, inquiry, rational thinking, facts and logic were. For the first time, a peasant could be more right than a baron or a king, because he had better observed the facts and had shown to be able to reason more just and precise. Of course, this long was only an ideal, and in practice those in power kept using their force to dominate the less powerful. But the idea of rationality, the principality of science, and the idea of essential human right was sown, and came slowly but steadily to blossom in the centuries to come. Maybe the pinnacle of freedom we encountered in the 60s and 70s of the last century. A perfect storm emerged. The young generation revolted against dogmatic structures that had proven themselves insufficient. The system as it was couldn't prevent two devastating world wars. So in their eyes it lost its credibility. The rise of atheism and secularization eroded the power of the churches. Rising levels of education made that young people started to develop their own ideas, and universities introduced them to science and Marxist thinking, which appealed to them as a perfect tool to fight the establishment. Economic growth provided more freedom as well. The welfare state guaranteed security for everyone. So being rebellious didn't mean you ended up in poverty. Instead, it was seen as a fundamental human right to raise your voice and verbally attack the authorities. The birth control pill marked a high tide in the liberation and freedom of women, as did, for example, the civil rights movement for people of color. The last 50 to 80 years marked an era we in the West enjoyed a level of freedom and autonomy we have never seen before. We were granted ever more liberties and enjoyed it to the fullest. This was also an era of amazing creativity, economic growth, prosperity and innovation. Think of information technology, health, agriculture, industry and education. It looked as if history had taken a definite turn into the right direction. But are we locking up that spirit of freedom again? I'm afraid we do. I work at the University of Applied Sciences, and never before has higher education had to deal with a generation of students who are in such a bad mental shape. Depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, fear of failure, social anxiety, and a worrying limited ability to make contacts, apply effective self-regulation, and deal with setbacks. All these demons are rampant at the moment. The features, causes and consequences of these disasters, because that is what I call them, are clearly discussed in three important books. The Coddling of the American Mind by Lukianoff and Haidt, The Anxious Generation written by Haidt himself, and Bad Therapy by Abigail Shrier. Together they paint a grim picture of our youth, based on clear and fact-based analysis. Let's start with the book The Coddling of the American Mind. I'll restrict myself to a short recap of the most important ideas of Haidt. For a more in-depth discussion, see episode 22 in this YouTube series. The central idea of Haidt is the rise of safetyism, an all-invasive fear of parents regarding the well-being of their children and an obsessive urge to control every aspect of the life of their kids. You can call it paranoid parenting. Without realizing, parents are not helping their children by doing so, but they are in fact harming them in an unprecedented way. They make kids weaker instead of stronger. Safetyism takes on many forms. We see a deep decline in unsupervised playing time for kids, and in schools and later university they are quote-unquote protected by things like trigger warnings, ideas about microaggressions and so-called safe spaces. Haidt leans heavily on the ideas of Nassim Taleb on anti-fragility. Living systems need some burdening, adversary, hardship and fighting to grow to their full potential. Erasing all this keeps children in a state of weakness, fear, dependency and vulnerability. And unfortunately, we see a vicious circle emerging here. The more weakness children show, the more parents are convinced they need protection, the more weaker children grow, etc., etc. The next book is a sequel of the first. In The Anxious Generation, Haidt discusses the impact of social media on the well-being of the younger generation, especially Gen Z, the ones born after 1995. When they enter puberty, some high-impact technologies invaded the social domain. Think of iPhones. First, there were the much stronger internet connections. Video content could be downloaded and uploaded in an instant. The like and retweet options on iPhone did the rest. Kids, especially young girls, started to upload photos and videos of themselves and opened themselves up to direct, uncensored feedback on their looks and personalities. Humans are evolved to value the opinions of the ones around them. But in this day and age, with the help of technology, this has completely run out of hand. The craving for likes works the same way as the craving for alcohol or drugs in substance addictive patients. In fact, a whole generation turned into junks, and big tech companies are in fact operating as drug dealers and drug producers, abusing their cleverest minds and the state of the art of scientific knowledge to make their products even more addictive, only thinking, how can we have our users spend even more hours a day on social media? And they are highly successful in it. The more time kids are occupied with their little screens, the more their emotional and mental state deteriorates. And realize this, of the girls 12 to 13% and of the boys 6% are super users, so they spend more than 40 hours or more a week on their iPhone. Think about what they don't do with this precious time. No sports, no physical activities, no spending physical time with friends, no interactions with real humans, not doing homework, not exploring surroundings, etc., etc. They suffer a serious lack of sleep, making it difficult to concentrate on all the other things in life that need concentrating too. According to Haidt, the coddling phenomenon is going on for some decades now, already showing its devastating impact. But this plague is even further enhanced by the technological developments I just mentioned, together forming a perfect storm. Haidt marks the years 2010 to 2012 as critical, and the statistics show him right. From that moment on, we see problems in youngsters with anxiety and depression peak. Never before was the youngest generation in such a bad state, and this all has to do with the social isolation and the lack of meaning and purpose. From the play-based childhood, the youngest generation has shifted to a phone-based generation. Children should be in a discover mode, but they are now en masse in a defend mode, living with the all-pervasive fear of negative social judgments or missing out on activities of their peers. You know the acronym FOMO, fear of missing out. Themes on inclusion and exclusion have never been more pervasive, predominantly in a very toxic way. Especially Gen Z takes the hardest blows. Of course, all people, like me, have iPhones too, but we use them merely as useful, quite neutral tools. A telephone without a wire, like in the old days, you could say. The addiction phenomena is much less with the grey folks. Only in Gen Z we see the spectacular peaks in the statistics. What exactly are the prime addictive and toxic ingredients of modern social media? First, there is the reward system it's based on. Behaviorists experimenting with lab rats soon discovered you can teach a rat pressing a lever by rewarding every time the rodent presses it. But if you really want the most persistence in the desired behavior, you do not so reward to reward every press, but giving rewards only on a random basis. Sometimes the rat gets its food after 7 presses, the next time only after 20 or so, afterwards 3 is enough. This reward schedule makes the behavior the most resistant to extinction. This has to do with the feeling of craving, which by this reward scheme is stretched to its ultimate intensity. Another important feature of social media is its non-physical mode. Like young animals, kids need to see, feel, touch and hear each other. They need to be together, talking, having rough and tumble games, fight and make peace again, and having adventures together. On social media, contact is stripped of some of its most essential features. From animal experiments and from kids growing up isolated, maybe you have heard of orphanages in Romania, we know the devastating consequences of this in later life. In natural contacts, feedback is immediate. If you are too rough in a play, the other one will let you know, just like the other way around. You learn to set and respect boundaries. Online contact, on the other hand, is asynchronous. It takes minutes to hours or days before you get response. And this response in many cases is quite anonymous, because you send your message to a big or even to an infinite big audience. Most of them you probably don't know that well at all. Natural groups are smaller and have a high entry and exit levels. So you got to know each other well, and there's ample of time to learn to trust one another. This is all missing in groups on social media. They are big, anonymous, and membership changes quickly and often. Responses or missteps are merciless, and they will never disappear. You get praise, but there's always the risk, the danger, the consuming fear you can become a victim the next moment. This puts kids in a defend mode and triggering the wrong neurological and hormonal stress responses in their young and fragile bodies and brains. Haidt called this the defend mode. The third in row of important books on this topic is from Abigail Shrier, called Bad Therapy. Maybe the main title is a bit misleading. It's not about the effectiveness, or lack of thereof, of psychotherapeutic interventions. It's about psychology and psychopathology having entered the wrong domains, more specifically parenting and education. They were not designed to be used here and consequently do more harm than good. Maybe we can say it's the logical and ultimate consequence of paranoid parenting. Let's take a concrete example. Carl Rogers coined the term non-directive therapy. He demonstrated you don't have to give people concrete advice to help them. In many cases, it's just enough to keep their process of thinking, feeling and reflecting going on. The therapist just has to listen empathically and fully involved and reflect on what the other is saying, thinking and feeling. In this process, it is important not to judge, even if the client is telling things that fall outside of your own moral framework. Accepting your client as he is and let him decide himself on change, on what topics and in what direction and in what pace. That turned out to be crucial. Rogers called this unconditional positive regard, and it is the best condition for people to grow and thrive. And of course, as a parent, it is important to give children mental space too. Don't judge negatively on everything they do, say or feel. Show them you accept them as they are and that you love them. But does this mean acceptance has to be unconditional? I don't think so. Kids are exploring the world, and to discover is to find out where limits are. If a boy jumps out of a tree, he will discover that this is fine up to about 2 meters. But if he takes an even higher jump, the pain on the landing will be uncomfortable. So he discovered something about himself and about the physical world. The same is true for his emotional and mental world. He pushes boundaries to discover where the limits are, and he expects from its parents and other grown-ups to help him in this process. Sometimes by asking explicit questions, many times by acting and observing when his parents stop him or give him guidance. Kids don't thrive in a limitless world. If everything is possible and choices are unlimited, he feels disoriented, alienated and lonely. His inborn instincts tell him there are borders, and being unable to find them is a sign you find yourself in a very unfriendly and even hostile and disconnected universe. So an important role of parents is their children to discover and respect boundaries, if only for the fact that later in life they will live in a world with boundaries too. Bessel van der Kolk and Gabor Mate are two famous experts on trauma and post-traumatic stress syndromes. But Shrier is very critical on them and affirms my nagging feeling when I read some books of these superstars. They seem to make almost everything into a trauma. This description was in the past reserved for very severe incidents like rape or shell shocks of soldiers in the trenches of World War I. But concept creep has made trauma into almost any negative event you can encounter in normal life, from physical punishment, strict rules, unempathic parents, lack of freedom or exclusion from participation in a sports team. Things everyone experiences sometimes in his or her lifetimes. And the fact that most people turn out to be quite healthy adults prove it's no use inflating this concept this way. Shrier therefore states explicitly, not trauma, but strength is the normal response to adversity. Again, the concept of anti-fragility, so important to understanding living systems, is willfully ignored, and the consequences of this turn out to be severe. Maybe we have psychologized daily life too much. Of course, it is important to know when a kid feels not well, is sad or upset. But has this to be checked on a regular basis, in schools, every time the kid is visiting a doctor? The example depicted here is quite mild, but Shrier gives some examples of checklists kids are routinely asked about depressions, thought of suicide, or whether someone else had touched their body in an inappropriate way. What is the message we are sending to kids? I think something like, be aware, you live in a weird, dangerous world. You can become a victim at any moment. Don't trust your parents to help you. Only we as professionals can. Well, I for one am not happy with this overemphasizing negative mental states, for we know that ruminating on your thoughts, and especially the negative ones, can often make depression and negative feelings even worse. We are encouraging a kind of mental hypochondria. Remember this, we thrive when we focus on an important external goal, when we get in a state of flow, and we don't ask ourselves whether we are happy or not, because we just are. Happiness is not achieved by looking inward too much. Happiness is the result of transcending yourself and committing to a higher goal. Modern paranoid parenting does just the opposite. The next thing we should consider is the trend to label every behavior that could be a little uncomfortable to the kid itself, but more often to the parents, school or other people. Staggering how many youngsters are diagnosed with ADHD, ADD, dyslexia, the autism spectrum, or whatever label you can think of. What are the effects on this on kids? At first it might be a relief. My problem is diagnosed, given a name, and I can blame everything going wrong on this condition. But in the long run it can be a serious blocker on your development. It's not healthy to have a permanent victim card in your pocket. And furthermore, diagnosis leads to the prescription of medicines, many of which we don't know the long-term consequences on the developing child's brain. So let's be careful. Just like social media are addictive drugs that should be regulated, so should the real drugs of which we don't know the long-term effects. To make the contrast clear, let's have a look at people not as weird as we are. You know, Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. Maasai boys as young as 10 or 12 years old herd the cattle of the tribe, the most precious possession, on which the well-being of the group depends, and they are expected to face lions, hyenas and other predators when necessary and not run away or back off. They are trained for this role as young kids and can't wait until the day they themselves are trusted with the herd. Of course, sometimes boys are killed or maimed, but this doesn't stop the Maasai from continuing this practice. First, because there is no other option to them, but also because it gives the boys an incredible feeling of strength, courage and status. When successfully fighting off a big predator, they are revered as heroes. Furthermore, he has shown his life is less important than the well-being and the future of the tribe. He is honored because he has proven to be willing to offer his life and limbs if necessary. This is what we mean by talking about transcendent goals. Things bigger, more important than you are yourself. These Maasai boys are not pampered. They don't suffer from depression or ADHD. They are proud men, knowing what's life about. Contrast this to modern youth. Okay, folks, that was it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video and the content gives you something to think about. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. See you on my next video.